Crossroads of conflict, the significance of Gaza. The Gaza Strip, a sliver of land home to millions, a pressure cooker of geopolitics. Wedged between Israel and Egypt, this tiny territory holds immense strategic weight. Control over its borders, particularly the Rafah crossing, has been a focal point of conflict for decades. For Israel, it's about security, a buffer against terrorism. For Palestinians, it's a lifeline, a connection to the outside world. The recent Israeli operation near Rafah, dubbed Defensive Shield, has once again brought this struggle to the forefront. It has underscored the complexities of the conflict, the humanitarian toll, and the precarious balance of power. Understanding Gaza's significance is key to grasping the wider Middle East puzzle. It's about land, yes, but also about identity, survival, and the elusive dream of peace. A history etched in sand, Israel's presence in Gaza. 1967, the Six-Day War. Israel seizes control of Gaza from Egypt. This victory, while decisive, sowed the seeds of future conflict. A large Palestinian population now found itself under Israeli military rule. The seeds of resistance were sown. Years of occupation followed. Settlements sprouted. Tensions simmered. Fast forward to 2005, Israel unilaterally withdraws from Gaza, dismantling settlements and pulling out its troops. A momentous decision met with hope and trepidation. Many saw it as a step towards peace. Others warned of a power vacuum. Their fears were soon realized. Hamas, an Islamist militant group, gains control of Gaza in 2007. They consolidate power, their grip tightening. Israel responds with a blockade, citing security concerns. The flow of goods and people is restricted. Gaza is increasingly isolated, its economy crippled. The stage is set for further confrontation. Operation Defensive Shield, shifting sands of control, October 2023. Tensions escalate after a Hamas attack on Israel. Israel launches a large-scale military operation in Gaza, its objective to dismantle Hamas's military infrastructure and restore its own security. The operation, codenamed Defensive Shield, focuses heavily on the area surrounding Rafah. The reasoning is clear. Rafah is not just a border crossing, it's a strategic artery. It's a potential route for weapons smuggling and a gateway for Hamas operatives. By tightening its grip on Rafah, Israel aims to cripple Hamas's ability to operate. But this operation is not without its critics. Human rights groups decry the operation, citing civilian casualties and displacement. They argue that the blockade, already in place for years, constitutes collective punishment. The international community watches with growing unease. Calls for a ceasefire go unheeded. The situation in Gaza is once again spiraling out of control. The human cost, a corridor of tears. The people of Gaza are trapped in a cycle of violence. Operation Defensive Shield has only deepened their suffering. Thousands are displaced, seeking refuge in overcrowded UN shelters. Food and water are scarce. Hospitals are overwhelmed. The Rafah crossing, their only gateway to the outside world, is effectively closed. Families are separated. The sick and injured are denied access to medical care. The stories emerging from Gaza are harrowing. They paint a picture of desperation, fear, and despair. The international community must act swiftly to alleviate the humanitarian crisis unfolding in Gaza. Humanitarian aid must be allowed to flow freely. The Rafah crossing must be reopened for the passage of civilians. The people of Gaza cannot be held hostage to this conflict. Section 5. Egypt's role balancing act on a tightrope. Egypt, Gaza's other neighbor, finds itself walking a tightrope. It shares Israel's security concerns about Hamas, but also recognizes the humanitarian plight of the Palestinian people. Its control of the Rafah crossing gives it leverage, but also a heavy responsibility. Cairo has condemned the violence and called for a ceasefire, but its actions have been measured. It fears being drawn into a wider conflict and is wary of Hamas's influence. Yet it cannot ignore the suffering on its doorstep. Egypt's role in mediating a ceasefire and finding a lasting solution to the Gaza conflict cannot be overstated. Its historical ties to the region, its diplomatic clout, and its own security concerns make it a crucial player. The question is whether it can navigate the competing pressures and broker a path out of this crisis. Section 6. Hamas, the defiant power in Gaza. Hamas, for its part, remains defiant. It views the Israeli operation as an existential threat and has vowed to resist by any means necessary. It has fired rockets into Israel, aiming to inflict maximum damage and sow fear. Its tactics have drawn international condemnation, particularly its indiscriminate targeting of civilians. Yet it enjoys considerable support within Gaza. Many Palestinians view Hamas as a resistance movement, fighting against occupation and for their rights. Hamas's grip on Gaza is unlikely to be broken by military force alone. Its ideology resonates with a population that feels disenfranchised and abandoned. Any lasting solution must address the underlying political and economic grievances that fuel its support. Section 7. International condemnation and the spectre of war crimes. The international community has roundly condemned the violence in Gaza. The UN Security Council has called for an immediate ceasefire and a return to negotiations. Human rights groups have accused both Israel and Hamas of war crimes, citing indiscriminate attacks on civilians and the use of disproportionate force. The International Criminal Court, or ICC, is under pressure to open an investigation into the situation in Gaza. The spectre of war crimes charges hangs heavy over the conflict, further complicating efforts to find a peaceful resolution. The international community's response has been largely rhetorical. Beyond condemnations and calls for restraint, there has been little concrete action to stop the bloodshed. The lack of a unified international response has only emboldened the warring parties, prolonging the suffering of innocent civilians. Section 8. The long road ahead, prospects for peace and stability. The road ahead for Gaza is fraught with uncertainty. Operation Defensive Shield may have temporarily silenced Hamas's rockets, but it has done little to address the root causes of the conflict. The underlying issues of land, security, and political representation remain unresolved. A lasting solution will require more than just a ceasefire. It will demand a fundamental shift in the dynamics of the conflict. Both sides will need to make painful compromises. The international community will need to play a more active role in facilitating dialogue and ensuring accountability. The alternative is a continuation of the cycle of violence that has plagued the region for decades. Another generation will grow up under the shadow of conflict. The dream of a just and lasting peace will remain elusive. Section 9. Strategic implications. A new reality in Gaza? Israel's operation in Gaza has shifted the strategic landscape. Its control over the Rafah corridor gives it greater leverage over Hamas. It has also deepened its involvement in Gaza, despite its previous withdrawal. This raises questions about Israel's long-term intentions. Will it seek to maintain its presence in Gaza, effectively reoccupying parts of the territory, or will it withdraw once again, leaving behind a power vacuum that Hamas is sure to fill? The operation has also strained Israel's relationship with Egypt. Cairo is wary of Israel's growing influence in Gaza and fears being drawn into a wider conflict. The events of recent weeks have highlighted the fragility of the peace treaty between the two countries. Section 10. The corridor of control, a pawn in a larger game. The Rafah corridor is more than just a border crossing. It's a symbol of the larger struggle over Gaza. Control over this narrow strip of land gives Israel a strategic advantage, but it comes at a heavy price. The humanitarian cost of the operation has been immense. The international community's condemnation has further isolated Israel, and the underlying issues that fuel the conflict remain unresolved. The struggle for control of the Rafah corridor is a microcosm of the wider Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It is a conflict with no easy answers, where every move has far-reaching consequences. Until a just and lasting peace is achieved, the people of Gaza will continue to pay the price.